Multidimensional Poverty Index in Africa, showing level trends and puzzles by Sabina Alkire. Well, Sabina directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, the OPHI, a research center within the Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. Her research interests and publications include multidimensional poverty measurement and analysis, welfare economics, a Murchison capability approach, the measurement of freedoms, and human development. She holds a doctorate in philosophy and economics from the University of Oxford. So before I give the word to Sabina, please let me go briefly into the session rules. Please keep your audio in mute at all times in order to limit the background noise. During the presentations, if you have questions and only for clarification purposes, please send them to organizers via the chat box at the bottom right of the screen. And during the Q&A session, questions can be asked by interactive chat, sending an instant message to Sophie Mitra. Thanks again. And Sabina, you have from 35 to 40 minutes for presentation in order to allow for 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and very thankful for Sophie and Marcelo in this thematic group for the opportunity. And I'm most interested in the end and in your interaction. So I will go through the methodology, which may be familiar to many of you, and then look a little bit more at the results in Africa. So the basis of this study is that every year our research center, together with the UNDP Human Development Report Office, publish updates of a global multidimensional poverty index. And those are the results we're going to study for Africa. But the index is not limited to Africa. It covers 100 or more developing countries. And it's been published since the year 2010 by the Human Development Report Office. And they publish national statistics. But as I will show in the presentation, we also have subnational, ethnic, rural, urban, and other statistics. And those are found on OPHI's website, which also has interactive web tools, mapping tools, and so on. Now, the global MPI has the same indicators for every country. And so in many cases, it's not as precisely matched to poor people's definitions of poverty. And so increasingly, national governments are developing their own national MPIs, just like they have national income poverty measures. And these reflect the particular priorities of poverty in a given decade, for example. So they might add work or in violence or a higher standard for education and so on. The global MPI is data constrained. For example, it does not have violence or empowerment or work or other dimensions we might wish. The methodology underlying the Multidimensional Poverty Index is an extension of the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke class of income poverty measures into multidimensional space. And this methodology, which I had the privilege to develop with James Foster, is very flexible. So although the global MPI has 3 dimensions and 10 indicators, Colombia's national MPI has 5 dimensions and 15 indicators, and other countries have others. Mexico has 7 dimensions. Chile has 5. So there are different parameters that governments use. So the methodology is general, but the global MPI shows one way it can be implemented. So the particular possibilities that we were able to implement for over 100 developing countries using the data available at the year 2010 has only 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standards, the same 3 as the HDI or the HPI, and 10 indicators. I won't go through them in detail, but they're in the slides. But for example, you are deprived in nutrition if anybody in your household is malnourished. You're deprived in child mortality if a child has died in the last 5 years. So the indicators are used in a 0-1 sense to identify whose achievements fall short of international standards for poverty in these different 10 indicators: not having electricity, not having safe drinking water, and so on. But what is distinctive about the MPI is that it starts with each person. And so all 10 indicators are gathered for every household. So this is Rosaline in the north of Cameroon, where one of OPHI's postdocs is from. And she's deprived in 5 indicators. One of her kids is not attending school, actually more than one, and they lack clean cooking fuel, adequate sanitation, electricity, or a dirt floor, anything better than a dirt floor, an improved floor. So a poverty measure basically starts by giving each person a deprivation profile, just like an income poverty measure gives each person a consumption aggregate or an income aggregate. And poverty is measured according to that. And in the case of multidimensional poverty, that's what gives it power to be broken down in different ways. Now, for those of you who also are participatory or have other kinds of qualitative insights, it is always very useful to go beyond the quantitative work and talk with people about their own experiences and their own ideas of poverty. Rosaline is one of 2 wives of her husband, and they have 11 kids. As I mentioned, some kids have to work in the field, so they're not in school. And they're in quite a difficult landscape, so it took 7 people all morning to harvest a bowl of peanuts. But also the poverty measure didn't mention that there was a lot of banter between them, a light atmosphere, love and affection within the family. So poverty measure is only an incomplete part of any person's life story, and we always want to go back to qualitative and participatory exchanges to really understand whether it is measuring the correct things. When you have a deprivation profile, then you identify a person as poor if they're deprived, in the case of the global MPI, in more than 1/3 or 1/3 or more of the indicators weighted at the same time. Each dimension is equally weighted, as you can see visually in the slide, and each indicator within a dimension is equally weighted. So she is deprived in 39% of dimensions, which is more than 33%, so she's poor. And then the final formula is just the incidence, the percentage of people who are poor because they're deprived in 33% or more at the same time, times intensity. And the intensity is the percentage of deprivations that poor people on average experience. Rosaline was 39%. On average in Cameroon, poor people actually have a higher intensity of poverty than Rosaline. But this feature of intensity also gives axiomatically some particularly useful properties to this measure, which we will show shortly, in that it can then be broken down by dimension. And this is, in a sense, the value added of this particular methodology. I'm not going to talk any more about the methodology, only to say that for those of you who are interested in more statistical, econometric, or other aspects, the full text of the book is online, so you can download anything on multidimensionalpoverty.org. Now, this year, in 2016, we draw on MPI data from 2000 to 2015, and that's then covering 102 countries. And if you remember, in 2010, when we started, we covered 104 countries, but those data were from 2000 to 2008. So our oldest data are 2005, and that means a number of countries, most of the countries actually, have new data sets. And so we are not reusing the old data sets that we started with. India is, I think, the oldest country for whom we have data, unfortunately. Now, within these 102 countries, 5.3 billion people live, and the predominant populations are in East Asia and South Asia, and about half as many in sub-Saharan Africa as in either of those regions. In Latin America, only 9% of these 5.3 billion people. But we have good population coverage in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's 96% of the population that's covered in our countries, South Asia, East Asia, and decent, 85% in Latin America, but much lower in Europe and Central Asia and in the Arab states. In terms of income categories, we cover 99% of people in low-income countries and 96% in lower middle-income countries. So it's quite good coverage in the quote-unquote developing world. But we also have some upper and high income countries, really to understand how this kind of poverty is experienced in those other settings. So just two global results, then we'll turn to the focus, which is in Africa. One is that if you just look at the headcount ratio, the percentage of people who are identified as poor, it's 1.6 billion. It's 30% of the people across those 102 countries are poor. And as you can see, a lot of it is in the highest levels of headcount ratio of incidence are in the Sahelian and Sudan Savannah belt in Africa. And the other slide that I will give, which is, I think, hopefully very familiar to many, is that if you plot the incidence, which is on the bottom axis, the percentage of people who are poor, against the intensity in the vertical axis, you see that actually they are not exactly the same. And also that the poorest countries often have a higher degree of poverty experienced by each poor person, a higher intensity. So this new feature of intensity not only gives axiomatic properties, but also it shows a little bit of the human costs of poverty. And we can aggregate the data in different ways. So if we look across the 5.3 billion, we can notice that 73% of them live in middle-income countries. 75% live in middle-income countries. But let's just look at the level in one period, that is the period of the survey in Africa. All data are aggregated using 2012 population data, and the surveys, as I mentioned, come from 2005 to 2015, with most of them coming from 2010 and later. So across Africa, which has about 1 million people, 54% of people are poor. That's combining North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And combining them, we cover 46 countries. And the composition we'll see a little bit more is a little bit different in East Africa than West Africa. And also the MPI incidence differs from the incidence of income poverty, and in a number of countries quite significantly. And the difference between MPI and income poverty is highest in African countries. Now, for 46 of those countries, we can do rural-urban decompositions, and for 41 of them, we can decompose them into subnational regions. And the poorest is Salamat in Chad. We just are updating that data now in Chad. There's a new data set we are working on. So first of all, let's compare the incidence of MPI and the incidence of income poverty in the 46 countries. And you can see that on the slide. So the height of the bar is the percentage of people who are in MPI poor, with South Sudan on the far right being the poorest. And the least poor is Tunisia. And then the black dot are $1.90 a day poverty when the surveys were fielded within 3 years. And you don't see that much of a relationship between the levels in Africa, just a very mild one. But you do see quite a bit of mismatch as well, though it tends to be that the lower poverty countries are lower. But from about the middle of the distribution on up, there is no relationship whatsoever. So that's why we say that these measures are complementary. They each add different information about a context. If we look at the countries that have the biggest mismatch, it is Ethiopia, where it's a 54 percentage point difference between the headcount ratio of MPI poverty and of $1.90 day poverty. Chad also is very large, as is Sudan. And so there are questions about data quality. There are questions about services versus cash transfers. There are many questions that we must uncover and study further to understand these mismatches. And I hope that some colleagues within this thematic group will do a bit of that. of course, if we look a little bit more closely at the incidence and the differences between MPI and income poverty, we must notice that we are covering different countries. So for example, you see Somalia is not covered by $1.90 a day, but it is covered by MPI. And the Botswana, for example, is not covered, or Angola at the moment, by MPI, but is covered by $1.90 a day. So some of the differences are due to different coverages. But even when we both cover the same countries, like Ethiopia, for example, you can see just visually that the levels of poverty differ a little bit, one from another. So Madagascar, for example, the island on the lower right is poorer in income terms than in MPI. So because of these differences in where we cover, naturally the population's share is different. But also the levels of poverty are different. And in particular, West Africa is more of the monetary poor people, 338 million monetary people, poor people live in West Africa, whereas in East Africa, 39% of the MPI poor people wake up every morning there. So there's quite a difference in the geographic distribution, some of it being a function of the countries covered and some of it being a function of the levels of poverty. Now, how are they poor is an interesting question. If we add up across countries the people who are both MPI poor and deprived in each indicator, population weighted, we can get the regional aggregates. And if you look at the far left, you see that in East Africa, the pink and red bar on the far left are just above 34%. Whereas if you look across in West Africa, the first bar of malnutrition is lower than child mortality. You also see that in general in West Africa, the living standard indicators of green shades are lower. So there's quite a difference just between those two regions. Clearly, North Africa is the least poor, followed by Southern Africa. But I think the value of the MPI is less at the regional level. That's quite crude. And it really comes into its own when we go subnationally, partly because that's where policies really are made, and partly because we can get a lot of detail that's not available for $1.90 a day measures, which recall $1.90 a day measures are only available nationally. Because of purchasing power parity, we cannot go subnationally and do subnational decompositions with $1.90 a day. So just to illustrate this, this is the country of Rwanda using 2014-15 data. And Kigali, the capital city in the middle, is the least poor, the darker green. But the others are more or less similar levels of poverty, with the north being a little bit less poor than the others. And so already we can see something in Rwanda, which is that there's more or less an equity regionally, except for Kigali. But it's quite interesting to be able to look across borders. And although most of our time is spent now on national measures because they are really more appropriate for policy, they have more country ownership, they're created using national statistics, there is still a value in being able to compare oneself with one's neighbor. And that is what the global MPI is good for. And so the arrow points to Rwanda, which is green, but you see that its neighbors have higher poverty than Rwanda. And if you then zoom in and look at subnational decompositions of DR Congo, Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, or Kenya, it's quite interesting. For example, if you compare the northern region of Burundi with Rwanda, you see that there's simply a political barrier, but it's dividing quite different levels of poverty. And similarly in the southwest southern Uganda. So these are interesting comparisons at an academic level. They're also interesting because countries are quite curious then about what the neighbors just across the borders have done, and it may set up some positive competition. Rwanda may be green, but still more than half of its citizens live in multidimensional poverty in 2014-15. So it's still very serious levels of poverty that we're talking about. So the percentages are the percentages of people who are poor. And I'm going to do the same thing for Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire is where we launched the global MPI. I'll also be there again next week. They've just become a lower middle income country, having been a low income country. And so it's interesting just to observe and study them a little bit more. So subnationally, their poverty is concentrated in the north. And Abidjan, the capital city, again, has the lowest poverty in the southeast. But again, if you look at them within their neighbors in West Africa, you can see Ghana is the green country to the right, and Mali and Burkina Faso. So again, subnationally, we can compare them. And here we see some continuity, northern Ghana and northwest of relationships that are quite interesting to countries to identify to what extent their poverty might be shaped more by environmental considerations than by considerations of governance, and the reverse. So if you look at northeast Côte d'Ivoire, which is less poor than its neighboring region of Burkina Faso, you can see some other bits. When we released these kinds of pictures, of course, in Côte d'Ivoire, there was a lot of interest because they really wanted to examine where they were being successful and how they could deepen that. Now, I've just shown comparisons in the headcount ratios and in MPI in the maps. But then, just as we compared the headcount ratio of MPI and income poverty, you can also look at other things. So, for example, Côte d'Ivoire is in bold, and it's a lower middle income country. So its GNI per capita is $1,450 per person per year. But what's quite interesting about that is these countries are ranked from the least poor to the poorest. But if you look at Togo, which is less poor than Côte d'Ivoire, then you see the GNI per capita is almost 1/3. It's $570 per person. Or Malawi, more recent data, a lower GNI per capita, but a lot less poor. So these comparisons really bring to light the need for supplements to simply looking at income per capita. You can also look at differences in intensity of multidimensional poverty or differences with $1.90 a day. Cameroon has the same as Côte d'Ivoire, but Cameroon has much lower MPI. And then nationally, I said you could pull apart each MPI to look at the components. And so just like we looked at the regions of Africa, we can do this for each country and see what percentage of the population in Côte d'Ivoire are poor and are deprived in each of the indicators. So you see the highest deprivations are in cooking fuel, followed by sanitation, followed by electricity and child mortality. If you look at rural and urban poverties, you can see, of course, that rural poverty on the far right is greater than urban poverty. But you can also see that the composition of poverty is quite different. And in particular, the educational deprivations are proportionally bigger in rural areas. This same level of detail is available at every subnational level. So these are the subnational regions in Côte d'Ivoire, from the poorest, the nord-est, to the least poor, Abidjan. And then you can look at the composition of poverty for each of them and see that the living standards contribute more in some of the regions, and in Abidjan it's more of the health deprivations that contribute. These are actually quite similar across the regions of Côte d'Ivoire. If you look at Cameroon or Malawi, there are lots of differences in composition of poverty across regions. And this is quite interesting when it comes to allocation of resources or programming to address the differently configured deprivation profiles. So that's, in a sense, the levels of poverty nationally and subnationally within different regions. And for each of them, these are the regions of Nigeria, just to show you one where there's a little bit more difference. Zamfara on the far left is the least poor, and Lagos on the far right is the poorest. And you can see quite large differences, with health being more prominent in Lagos. But you can also see between Zamfara and Yobe, which have more or less the same levels of poverty, education deprivations, the yellow bars, are more prominent in Yobe. So these, in a sense, are why countries are interested, because of the SDG priority, leave no one behind, or to have more coordinated, integrated governance policies that address interlinkages between deprivations. So moving now to trends, all of that was quite static, one moment at a time. So for 35 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we use changes over time. And in 30 of these, there was a statistically significant reduction in MPI, and Rwanda had the fastest reduction. So that's quite a good proportion of countries that reduced MPI. However, there's a little bit of a note of caution about that, in that of those 30 countries, in 12 of them, the number of poor people reduced. But in 18 of them, population growth was so fast that although the percentage of poor people went down, the number of poor people went up. So there's a big need to consider population when we think of poverty trends. Just to give you a few other happy cases, in 5 countries, Burkina Faso, Comoros, Gabon, Mozambique, and Rwanda, all of the 10 indicators of MPI had statistically significant decreases. And there were also decreases in absolutely every subnational region, in Gabon, Ghana, Gambia, Liberia, Mozambique, Malawi, Niger, and Rwanda, showing that there was quite an equitable progress across the subnational regions. The subnational regions, I'm going to talk today for time reasons only about the countries, but we also have online in Table 6 all of the data and the composition and details, populations, etc., for 234 subnational regions. And these cover 807 million people. We've strictly harmonized the data so that you can compare across countries very rigorously. And we compare annualized changes while recognizing that if the periods between surveys are 12 years rather than 2 years, we will have a larger probability of having statistically significant results. So in terms of absolute reduction of poverty, you'll see that Rwanda on the bottom had the fastest, followed by Ghana, Liberia, Comoros, DRC, and Tanzania. And you'll see the respective year periods. We have 50 comparisons. So for 15 countries, we have 3 time comparisons. And Rwanda was fastest between 2005 to 2010, but it slowed a little bit between 2010 and 2014-15. And you'll see that Rwanda 2014-15 is higher up. If you consider the reduction relative to the starting point, so relative to the percentage of people who were poor in period 1, what percentage of them were reduced in period 2? You'll see South Africa had the fastest. South Africa didn't have much poverty, 11%, but it came down very rapidly. And so did Congo, Ghana, but also Comoros and Rwanda. So Rwanda, Comoros, Ghana had strong reductions in both absolute and relative terms. Now, going beyond this is very important. So first of all, if you look at the far right, we're showing the statistical significance at alpha equals 0.01, 1%, for reductions in MPI, in incidence, and in intensity. And we see, for example, that Côte d'Ivoire, in these 2 periods, 2005 to 2011-12, had significant reduction. But we also see that the number of poor people increased during that period. What's quite interesting for policy is to see how MPI decreased. And so in particular, what percentage of people who were poor and deprived in each dimension, how did that change? And for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, the biggest reduction was in inadequate sanitation, followed by drinking water, school attendance, and child mortality. This provides political incentives to recognize and celebrate success in different ministries and different programs. I also mentioned that of the countries that did not reduce MPI in every subnational region, there's always still a question of how pro-poor their poverty reduction was. Did the poorest region reduce MPI the most, or did the poorer regions tend to have a faster production? So this graphic is quite useful. It plots the level of MPI on the horizontal axis. So the northeast, nordest, is the poorest because it's furthest to the right-hand side, and Abidjan on the far left is the least poor. And the height is the speed of reduction. So it's a race to the bottom, and the one that's further down on this slide is winning. So it's a pro-poor, it's a happy result because the poorest region, the northeast, reduced MPI the fastest. And not only that, but it was actually faster than any African country except for Rwanda. And in the northeast, the number as well as the level of poverty went down. So it's quite useful to do this country by country, and again to point out, give feedback for the policies. It's also important to compare the MPI trends with monetary trends, because if they were the same policies reduced both of them, there's less of a need to measure them separately. But actually what we see is that only in DRC Congo was the rate of reduction the same. And in the others there was differences, including quite big differences. So the arrow is over Côte d'Ivoire, which didn't do outstanding, but had a stronger reduction of MPI, the red bar, than income poverty, the green bar. But if you look at Rwanda, it had a very good reduction of MPI on the far left, but an apparent positive change. We have standard errors for MPI, but we don't have them. So we don't know if the increase in $1.90 was statistically significant. But we do know that the reduction of MPI was. And so you see that a number of the countries that had strong reductions in MPI didn't necessarily have the same in income poverty. The ideal, of course, is to reduce both kinds of poverty powerfully. And finally, looking across the countries, again with the same axes, and the poorest countries, Niger and Ethiopia, being on the far right, and the level being the reduction, you see Rwanda had the fastest reduction in the middle, and Côte d'Ivoire, which is pointed out, was not the poorest, but by no means had the fastest reduction. So it's again useful to compare countries in different periods and with each other, in a sense to develop a healthy sense of competition. I'd like to close with some puzzles, things we don't understand. And one came out that I told you that Rwanda had the fastest reduction in MPI. But we compared for these 234 subnational regions how fast they reduced MPI. And we found that in 19 cases, subnational MPI reduction was faster than Rwanda in particular periods. And the fastest actually was the COA in Liberia and regions in Congo, DRC, and Mauritania. And so our question to people who know these countries or these regions is it true? We tried to corroborate with other data sources and with the press, and to our understanding it is. So we tried to get independent evidence of a change, but we are stuck on the why. What were the drivers? When was it an NGO? When was it a particular donor program? When was it a migration of highly skilled people or activities of a particularly enlightened leader? So what can we learn that might be of use? So those are the map. The red shows where these regional runaways are. And you recognize that some of them are in the poorest regions of Africa. And so it's a nice surprise. It's very important to learn from such regions. And here is their name. And the fastest, as I mentioned, was Likwola in Congo, Sanga in Congo, Cuvette Ost in Congo, and Nord Kivu in DRC. So if any of you are doing work on these regions, if you have insights, it would be quite interesting to do qualitative Q-squared or other kinds of work to understand these positive outliers and try to learn from them. My slides seem to be frozen. Aha. So now this has been my presentation, and we at OPHI come from different places. We come from Latin America, from Sub-Saharan Africa, from Lebanon, from Germany. So there are different folks on the research team. But because this is a study on Africa, of course, the agency, the insights, and the voices of our colleagues are very important. So that you know that although I am presenting it, hopefully it reflects the wisdoms and insights of many other colleagues who are not here. I just wanted to share with you some of the interesting observations we got from different colleagues who reviewed our work and helped us to try to understand it a little bit more fully. Madame Albina Chua is the Director of Statistics in Tanzania, and Zanzibar was one of the regions that had extraordinary progress, the little island with spices. And so they were quite interested in that result, and they are working also to create a national measure that's more appropriate for Tanzania. Charles Lufumfa from the African Development Bank really wanted us to go more into looking how different aspects of poverty are interlinked, because that's a hypothesis in the Sustainable Development Goals, but there's also, challenges in coordinating many people and managing intersectoral programs. And Ayo from the UNDP Regional Bureau for Africa really liked the subnational detail and was hoping to use that a little bit further and to study some of the regional runaways in addition. The Islamic Development Bank was particularly interested in the issue of population growth that's wiping out the gains, and also in the precarious climatic belt and the link between harsh environment and high poverty that you see across the savannah and the Sahel. And Pali Lohola, the Statistician General of South Africa, of course, was delighted that South Africa had the fastest reduction. But he also recently published a community survey that's quite interesting, where he asked people in Africa, what are your values? What should the weights across the dimensions and indicators of poverty be in SAMPI, which is the South African National MPI? And it was interesting, and I think relevant for other contexts, that they showed that actually the roughly equal weights across dimensions were corroborated when they went to the communities and did this questionnaire. So it's been a very interesting journey with them, trying to understand how we can make the measures of poverty more proactively engage and reflect the values and experiences of poor people in communities. So I will close there. I always end on this slide just to say that we measure poverty, we think about it, we analyze it, but of course the reason we do so is to try to change it while respecting the voices and agency of poor people. And so I end on this slide with a quote from Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen. Thank you so much, and I do look forward to your interventions, corrections, comments and questions.
Thank you, Sabina. We're all clapping. You cannot hear us, but we are all clapping. Marcelo, were you going to start? Okay, maybe we've lost Marcelo.
Yeah.
You there?
Very much for such a wonderful presentation that gave us insightful details on the poverty trends in Africa. I'm not sure if you have already questions and answers in the list, Sophie.
Well, I have a couple of questions. Yeah, if I may start.
Sure.
And then while I'm asking my questions for everyone. Feel free to send questions through the chat box, or later on you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly. So just a couple of questions, and Sabina, if it takes too long to answer them, maybe we can carry on the conversation later. Starting from the smallest question in scope, when you talk about the regional runaways, is this based on improvements that are sustained over several years, or are you looking at just an improvement in 1 year? So that's my first question. Second is about the results that you have for Côte d'Ivoire. I think they have really important policy implications for country classifications. The country classification that is used worldwide is GNI per capita. That's the classification by the World Bank, and this is used in practice by donors. And yet, so we see for the case of Côte d'Ivoire that although although a country could be moving up in terms of GNI per capita, the picture could be very different when it comes to using other measures such as the MPI. And finally, I'm wondering about your work with respect to policy. I mean, your results have really important policy implications. Have you already worked on policy or program evaluations? For instance, a lot of countries have cash transfer programs that could impact several of the dimensions of the MPI. So are you using the MPI to conduct targeted policy or program evaluations? So that's a lot, but...
No, very good. So first of all, in terms of this list of regional runaways, it is just the survey periods that we cover, and I do apologize, this table doesn't have the years, and I should have said the Republic of Congo between different years, and they are online, so I do apologize for that. But it's just one period, and we will be looking as we increase our database at trends in longer periods of time. We already are up to 70 countries with trends over time, and now we're back analyzing to have longer periods. So there's a lot of computations going on over here. But at the moment, we are not seeing sustained reductions at the same level, and that's why I have not yet predicted reductions in MPI in the future, because we don't see them precisely the same. Nigeria, 2003 to 2008, had a significant reduction in the South-South region, though not nationally, but there was no reduction until 2013, nothing significant. So, and that's a huge country, so you can't really predict. So we are basically gathering data. Second, in terms of middle-income countries, that's a very important point, and it's part of the reason that we try to show these very poignant examples. And the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, which is now over 50 countries that are exploring multidimensional poverty metrics, or already have them. They have added, last week in Acapulco when we gathered for an annual meeting, they added one of the priorities as being to communicate to the international development assistance community the need to consider the level of MPI and income poverty, and not just the level of income when allocating support. And finally, in terms of conditional cash transfers, as I said, with the global MPI, there is not at the moment that much in policy terms, although some governments are using an equivalent of the MPI, and that includes South Africa at the moment for policy, but they will be using other measures shortly. But the countries that do use MPIs use them for targeting, for budget allocation, for policy coordination, for evaluation of activities. So an example is the government of Colombia, which, for example, has a conditional cash transfer program with linked programming for the different dimensions in their MPI, health, education, work, living standards, and services. And you cannot graduate from the conditional cash transfer unless two conditions are matched. One is you are no longer income poor, and the second is you are no longer MPI poor by the MPI of Colombia. And President Santos made this, his personal almost statement when he launched the MPI in 2011, and it retains very high levels of political support. There's a speech by him on our website that he sent for the launch of the Atkinson Commission report by the World Bank, where he charts Colombia's rapid reduction of multidimensional poverty and the importance measurement had to shaping allocation and coordination decisions. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Sabina. We had a question from Cydia Chambers. Cydia, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much, Sabina. My question is, does the intensity measure capture the relationship between the indicators?
Yes, in the sense that the intensity adds up the weights on the indicator in which each person is deprived. It's not an elasticity, substitutability, or complementarity. It's simply agnostic as to which of those relationships hold. But it presumes that more is worse. And so it goes along that way.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we have a question from Jennifer Rogla. Jennifer, would you like to say your question, or shall I go ahead and say it for you? Okay, maybe I'll go ahead since you typed it in. Does OPHI encounter any resistance by countries to using the MPI on a national level or to creating context-specific subnational measures? If so, what are some of the reasons countries resist?
That's a good question. Earlier on, there was resistance. So even 3 or 4 years ago, people weren't sure that it was a good methodology. They thought income poverty told the whole story. I think now we don't have much resistance for a number of reasons. One is that the Sustainable Development Goals clearly say poverty is multidimensional, and Target 1.2 seeks to reduce poverty in all its dimensions. A second reason is that governments are learning from each other about the political usefulness of having a single measure, not a very extensive dashboard. Another reason is sort of safety in numbers. Now, it's not just Mexico, Colombia, and Bhutan, but it's also Chile, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Pakistan, Honduras, Armenia, all have official national poverty statistics, and a number of other governments are using them. So there's enough of a critical mass, perhaps. And the last is that I mentioned the report that Sir Tony Atkinson chaired, a commission for the World Bank chief economist on how to measure global poverty. And that report, recommendations 19, recommends that the World Bank report an MPI using this methodology. It also recommends it add not only health, education, and living standards, but also nutrition, work, and violence to the MPI. The World Bank cover note response by Chief Economist Paul Romer and his colleagues Ana Roenga and Chico Ferreira indicate that they do intend to pursue that recommendation, although not at the moment using work and violence and nutrition, but just a limited set of indicators. So I think that some people want to follow more progressive countries, some people want the safety from the World Bank, but there's a lot of movement in this area, which is opening space for national innovation and subnational. So the city of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam or Medellin in Colombia, they are all exploring subnational city measures.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Julia Greco. I'm going to read it out to you, Sabina. So she thanks you, and she would like to know if some countries have adapted the MPI to make it more relevant for the context. For example, during one of Julia's lectures on poverty and development economics at Makerere University, students questioned the MPI for the following reason. in one of the MPI poorest region in Uganda, Karamoja, people are nomadic and do not value traditional assets, housing, etc. They care mostly about cattle, which does not feature in the MPI. So if there is an experience of subnational MPI that has been adapted to local needs, Julia would appreciate if you could let us know.
Very good. Yes. For example, the national MPI Bhutan includes livestock. And that's also because cows, yaks, they're very, very important sources of wealth. They are better reflections of assets for some families than other durable assets. So that is the case for a national measure. In terms of subnational measures, for example, Colombia made a specific measure for its indigenous population, Africa Colombiano, because both their language requirements and their housing, what they consider and value in terms of housing standards differs from national standards. So they decided to do a special measure for that population group. And Vietnam is considering having different cutoffs across different subnational regions. There's always a balance between a measure that cannot be compared with other groups, but is more accurate, and a measure that can be compared, but is less accurate. So Mexico decided not to do a separate measure of indigenous poverty, but rather it used the same measure for indigenous and non-indigenous poverty, and still found that over 75% of indigenous people were poor. So it depends on each context how they decide to go ahead. The technology is very flexible, so it can be used to suit the context. It's a time of great exploration and innovation.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Cydia Chambers.
On the notion of the national statistics, or where countries are at, Sabina, could you elaborate a bit on the status of Jamaica with regards to their response to the MPI?
Jamaica is within the Eastern Caribbean states. It has very good data and very strong statistical capacity, and it is also on the interagency expert group on SDG indicators. So there is work at the national level in Jamaica in the early stages to develop a national MPI. There is also work with the OECS states to develop MPIs, but in many of the Eastern Caribbean states, they will have to put the questions into a labor force survey because they don't have the extensive survey that Jamaica has. We do have, as of last year, 2016, Jamaica included in the global MPI, and we use the National Conditions of Living Standard Survey in Jamaica for the global MPI.
Okay. But in terms of the specifics, because you spoke earlier about the different valuable objects, given the fact that a lot of national statistics don't normally capture that data. Is there any changes to the survey of living condition? Because I've used it for I'm using it for my thesis, and there are numerous gaps in it in terms of what people value and what the survey captures. So is there any plan to modify the data to include the things that people value and not just what's in the survey?
I don't know. Each government, when they start on the process of building a national MPI, have to decide whether to use existing data or whether to feed a survey. And they have done both. So Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Mexico, they all fielded new surveys. Colombia, Pakistan, they use existing surveys. So it's a common trade-off. And I don't know which way Jamaica will go.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I think we have one last question. Marcelo?
Yes. No, it's just, yeah, thank you. No, it's just, I think one of the major breakthrough in this presentation was the breakdown in regions, subnational regions, and the fact they are comparable. So one of the major challenges we have is about the dependency on these databases. They are not always yearly available. So just would like to know how do we deal with these databases that come across from maybe 2005 to 2015. So what would be the limits or the concerns on using these databases to produce a map like this map of Africa? So is that a static picture, or maybe there are some moving trends on that picture on the map of Africa, considering the lag of the databases?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And you're right, the DHS and MIX surveys, which we tend to use, tend to occur every 3 to 5 years. As I said, of the 104 countries that we have now, 55 of them have data since 2012. So it's quite a lot. And then you can go back in time and you pick up more. But there's a lot of the data is recent because there was a push and a lot of new surveys. We updated 38 countries in 2015, and many of them in Africa. So it's quite recent, but it will be updated every 3 years. Some surveys, for example, the South African NIDS is every 2 years. The China panel survey is every 2 years. And Senegal and Peru have annual DHS surveys. So there are some that are more recent. And we certainly would value that. But it is a time also of change in data with the Sustainable Development Goals. And because we are data users, we do not know how those changes will affect the global MPI and our ability to continue publishing it.
Great. Thanks, Sabina.
Okay, so we're out of time. So thank you so much, Sabina, for presenting, for your time this morning, and your very clear and thought-provoking presentation. This is very much appreciated, and thank you all for attending. I know it's not always a convenient time for all of you around the world, but thank you for making the time to attend. The webinar was recorded and will be posted on the HDCA website in case you missed. I know some of you came late, others had to leave early. So in case you missed part of it, we will have the recording and the slides on the HDCA website posted soon. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.